Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Mehmet Darakçıoğlu, and I am the Assistant Dean for Global Programs at Gallatin. I have also had the privilege of working with Gallatin's Urban Democracy Lab, that is the organizers of tonight's lecture. Our talk tonight is entitled Shock Events and Coup Attempts, Trumpism and Threats to Democracy. The coup attempt of January 6th was the logical outcome of all that President Donald Trump and the GOP under his leadership stand for: the normalization of extremism, the legitimation of violence, and an ethos that to stay in power is justified by enemies, present threats to our democracy going forward. At this point, it should all be clear to us that American exceptionalism and the metaphor that America is a shining city on a hill is nothing but an empty rhetoric. The coups, insurgencies, and the illegitimate overthrow of a democratically elected government that we often see in our TV screens in some remote parts of the world can very well take place here in America. As someone who has witnessed two successful and one unsuccessful military coup attempt in his lifetime, I can say that living under a military regime or with the fear of an impending military takeover is not fun. I can also say that living under civilian authoritarianism is not fun and can also be extremely destructive. Therefore, when people hear the footsteps of fascism, they should be very careful and do everything at their power to avoid it. We heard those footsteps loud and clear on January 6, 2020, on the steps of the US Capitol. We cannot possibly have a better scholar and intellectual other than Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who can explain us what went wrong that day and its underlying causes. Ruth Ben-Ghiat is a historian, educator, and commentator on fascism, authoritarian leaders, and propaganda, and the threats these present to democracies around the world. She's a professor of history and Italian studies at New York University and an author whose work has been featured on CNN and in New Yorker and the Washington Post. Her newest book is Strongmen from Mussolini to the present, an examination of authoritarian playbook illiberal leaders have used for centuries. If you have not received a copy, I do highly recommend get one. It's really a fascinating book to read. On that note, I will turn it over to Ruth to hear her take on Trumpism and threats to democracy. If you have any questions, please write down on the Q&A function and I will ask them to Ruth at the end of her presentation. Thank you, Ruth.
Thank you, Mehmet, and everyone at the Urban Democracy Lab. So coups, shock events, states of exception. These terms might seem to have little to do with domestic realities in America, although helping them to take place in other countries was long a feature of American foreign policy, especially during the Cold War. In this talk, I'm going to argue that the Trump administration exposed Americans to all three as part of the authoritarian playbook Trump and his collaborators implemented during the administration. We've been subjected to psychological warfare as well as a barrage of disinformation, which is why so many people feel exhausted now, even without the mass tragedy of the pandemic. And as Mehmet said, the coup attempt of January 6th was a logical outcome of developments at the heart of the project of Trump and the GOP. So first, some background on the subjects at hand. Military coups are less common today, although we just had one in Myanmar. But they've been the most common path to authoritarian rule, accounting for 75% of democratic failures globally since World War II. And a third of my book, Strongmen, is about coups for that reason. Coups play on the element of surprise. They often happen in the morning when you're going to work or to school, meaning you could leave your house in a democracy and you return, if you return at all, you return to a state of emergency. And coups almost always are undertaken in the name of the people, even though in a well-executed coup, the people had no idea it was coming. And justifications for coups recur over a century, such as preventing economic disaster, or leftist apocalypse, or removing a corrupt leader, or keeping a leader in power, which was the object of January 6th. Whatever their specifics, coups are designed to shock people into submission. As such, they're a common form of the shock event, a grave incident that often prompts declarations of states of emergency. Some shock events help new leaders to secure their power, as in the Reichstag fire, as that did for Adolf Hitler. And others give authoritarian leaders the excuse to do what they wanted to do anyway, like securing their hold on government and silencing the opposition. And this is what happened with the 2016 coup attempt against Erdogan in Turkey. I'm going to share my screen because I'll have some slides. Oh, hang on a second. Okay, there we go. Move this back up. And this is a very interesting image. When the coup happened, Erdogan was on vacation and he took refuge, and he called into CNN Turk late at night, appealing for help. And this kind of made him into this leader in distress, almost a victim. And so look at how she's cradling, the CNN Turk anchor is cradling his image. He looks small. And this was very effective in mobilizing public opinion for him and turning it against those who were trying to have the coup. I wanted to have this, I discussed the coup at length in my book. I wanted to have this image in there, but CNN Turk, not surprisingly, said no. So when that happens, when there's a shock event and it's used to do things, repressive things a leader wanted to do anyway, the temporary state of emergency may become normalized, no longer the exception, but the rule, as the anti-Nazi philosopher Walter Benjamin put it. For a century, knowing how to capitalize on calamity, whether you had something to do with it or not, has been an essential strongman skill. I was among the earliest to see Trump's ascent to the White House as a grave threat to democracy, and not only because of his deep ties to Russia and his criminal activities. During his campaign, he surrounded himself with dangerous individuals. Why isn't this going ahead? Okay. With dangerous individuals who had decades of experience in psychological warfare and the subversion of free societies, such as Roger Stone, who's shown here with the Oath Keeper militia right before the assault, Paul Manafort, and together they worked for Mobutu and Marcos and other dictators, and of course Manafort worked for Putin as well. To informal campaign advisor who kept behind the scenes but did a lot more than we know, most people know, Henry Kissinger, who here he is with Trump at the White House the same day as Trump brought Kislyak and Lavrov, the Russians, into the Oval Office, which was truly shocking to see. And to the far-right propagandist and activist Steve Bannon, who had long wanted to give the system a shock, in his words, to jumpstart a right-wing populist insurgency. And in January 2017, as White House chief strategist, a position Trump created for him, and it's interesting now to reflect back on what he was supposed to be strategizing beyond the destruction of democracy, he got the power to test his theory. He asked White House advisor Stephen Miller to draft a list of 200 executive orders to be implemented in the first 100 days of the Trump administration, a kind of blitzkrieg designed to create disorientation and fear. That ambitious plan remained unfulfilled, but the order to ban individuals from certain predominantly Muslim countries from entering the US went through. As intended, it threw the country into a state of chaos that stranded travelers, stymied federal employees, and prompted mass protest at ports of entry. It gave the public a visceral introduction to the psychological warfare that authoritarian propagandists had used for years, letting Americans know that this was no ordinary political transition. As Kellyanne Conway tweeted a week after the election, get used to it, after the inauguration, get used to it. POTUS is a man of action and impact. Promises made, promises kept. Shock to the system, and he's just getting started. I read that tweet with dread, and I got busy writing a CNN op-ed, which actually was the piece that most scared me to write of the close to 80 that I have done. And I give CNN lots of credit for publishing it February 1st, 2017, with the title that I suggested, Trump and Bannon's Coup in the Making. It argued that although Trump gained power legally, his administration would be a kind of extended shock event or a state of exception, or a slow-mo coup. The mandate was to strike at the system, using chaos to create a kind of government within the government, staffed with loyal insiders, beholden only to the president. I also predicted they would purge federal agencies of critics and those not aligned with his right-wing agendas. And these ideologues would transform the federal government. And, you know, unfortunately, I hate to be right. I'm very sad I was right about this. And we haven't even begun to digest the magnitude of the changes in policy and personnel at the State Department, the EPA, and other agencies. While each player had its own priorities, you have Mike Pompeo and William Barr were top collaborators. Trump's was, of course, turning government into a money-making machine for Trump Organization, which is a very autocrat thing to do. As we gain more perspective, I believe we will see the Trump administration project as a right-wing counter-revolution to protect white Christian hegemony and install, over time, an authoritarian model of governance. And that's how it appears to me, and that's what I argue in my book, which covers other right-wing authoritarian projects from Mussolini onward. And like those strongmen of the past and some of the ones in the present, Trump energized and legitimized existing anti-democratic and racist extremist sentiments. He added a leader cult, and this gave extremists and malcontents a focus, a purpose, and a momentum. The leader cult is important to channel things. And I'm quite sure the neo-Nazis of Charlottesville, who were demonstrating in 2017, never expected that a president of the United States would call them very fine people. Now, all of this matters when we consider the post-history of the November election. The moment Trump refused to accept the results and his GOP subordinates followed his example, a state of exception opened in our country. And of course, it was completely foreseeable that Trump would not go quietly. The authoritarian playbook has no chapter on failure, has no pages on the horror of being voted out of office or forced into exile. Democratic presidents with a small d see leaving office as a chance to build on their legacy. The authoritarian regards the loss of adulation and power and immunity from prosecution as an existential threat. So that's why they're supremely unprepared to leave office, and they turn to desperate measures like starting wars or planning coups to stay there. There's even a name in political science for this phenomenon called gambling for resurrection. Almost all autocrats lose the wager. And Trump was one of these. The methods he used to try and overturn the election in these long months from the election to inauguration of Biden draw from all eras of authoritarian history. And we should pay close attention to them since they could be normalized in the future, part of the way the GOP conducts its business as a far-right party, because the GOP no longer has its feet much in democracy or in democratic political culture. It's comparative political studies of put the GOP in global perspective show it lines up not with conservative parties, but with far-right parties. And this is a sobering truth that many probably have not yet accepted. So first, Trump evoked the age of military coups in exploring a military intervention until General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, put an end to that idea. And Milley had been used as a prop in the summer crackdowns against the Black Lives Matter protests, which were a rehearsal. I saw them as a rehearsal for possible larger scale government actions. I saw them that way at the time. The flooding of the Capitol with so many law enforcement officials, many of them unmarked, was a classic psychological warfare tactic. It displayed the state's power, but also played with ambiguity for added anxiety. Who are these armed individuals? And what can they do to me? And the assault and detention of hundreds of journalists and the bundling of protesters into unmarked vans reinforced the point. And of course, the shades of juntas in Latin America. And of course, this is what Erdogan does. He kidnaps people from 18 foreign countries so far, and he bundles them into cars and vans off the street, and he ships them back to Turkey. So this is why Milei put an end to this with his declaration. So then Trump and company are also trying to pull off the favorite 21st century despot trick of electoral manipulation, pressuring state officials, well-known story, of course, to find votes, as he did with Georgia's Secretary of State. And this is how authoritarianism already operates under Putin and Erdogan, leaders Trump admires. Election results that don't go your way become just another piece of information to be denied and replaced with a fabrication that suits the reality you need to stay in office. Trump set an American precedent, saying he won the election and then attempting to manipulate votes to make that claim true. That it didn't work is no less serious, since with the right players, the game could have had a different outcome, which is why the GOP is now purging state and local officials who are not loyal enough. They're not going to make the same mistake again. In fact, if they regain the White House and remain anchored to these illiberal methods, which they are, in 2024, these maneuvers and the current attempts to pass voter suppression laws will look back and see this period we're living through now as the foundation for an authoritarian capture. And finally, Trump channeled early fascism in calling on his most loyal supporters. This is the lead up to January 6th, including extremists in and outside of the government, to stop the steal and rescue him from defeat. I am reminded of black shirts and brown shirts who used violence to defend their leaders. And one insurgent, wore a Camp Auschwitz t-shirt to make the link clear. For years, Trump had posed as the man, like their man, to these extremists, and he cultivated their loyalty, starting with his 2015 retweet of a neo-Nazi meme. And so he started his presidential campaign with this in mind. And, it's now like 5 years of this, and it paid off. As for those followers, the history of authoritarianism tells us that those who feel their leader is endangered can become extremely volatile. And I was keeping a close eye as soon as Trump lost the election on these followers. It's a very, I started a video blog called The Transition because I realized this was going to be a very fateful and rocky period. And the day after the election, I did a video that went viral saying that, yes, we should celebrate, but we also have to be very cautious because for Trump's followers, there's going to be big reactions in them. And here, Trump's highly effective propaganda in depicting him as a victim matters. Although he lost the election, for his followers, he's still a winner, someone who has been unjustly robbed of what is rightfully his. So January 6th is a kind of rescue operation out of right-wing regimes. They acted to liberate and save their leader. And of course, Trump's personality cult is crucial in all of this. And it's really important that at the January 6th rally, the video he released, and in the video he released after the assault was going on, he told them he loved them. He said, "I love you and you're special, and our journey together is just beginning." And this expression of love and bonding is part of the incitement. So the incitement is not just to trash the Capitol and commit violence. The incitement was also in Trump's telling them he loved them and that he will be there for them. Of course, then he wasn't there and he was watching it on TV, which is typical. So they're committing violence for him on his behalf because they feel valued and elevated by him. And this is extremely important in the leader-follower dynamic. So it's not surprising that the propaganda film shown at the rally right before they left for the Capitol. This is the final scene. The final frame is Trump's face that fills the screen. And I was amazed when I saw that, because I wrote a book on fascist film propaganda, and there's a film that ends with a Mussolini surrogate who was known to be a Mussolini surrogate, exactly the same way, with his face filling the screen. So I'm going to stop sharing. The authoritarian style party discipline imposed on GOP lawmakers after the second impeachment trial and going through today, it makes sense in this framework, as does tragically the statement of Representative Peter Meyer of Michigan, who voted to impeach Trump. Quote, "Our expectation is that somebody may try and kill us," he said, explaining why he and other insubordinates had bought body armor. So this is no longer a democratic political climate when a congressman is saying he expects that someone will try and kill him because he broke with party discipline. This is authoritarian political culture. And 2 months after the event, the GOP has settled on its narrative, and it's really unfortunate that individuals like Scalise and others who perpetuate the stolen election myth needed to explain January 6th are still given primetime exposure to tell their lies. Every time they speak, they are telling you really clearly that the GOP has decided that violence is an acceptable means to stay in power, and that they are ready to, if they can get back in the White House, to finish the job of wrecking democracy. There's no expression of remorse. Even Mike Pence, still struck by this, that he was chased by a mob wanting to hang him. He has not spoken. So this is authoritarian style party discipline. And the history of authoritarian takeovers bears this out. January 6th was a trial run, you could say, and failed coups are often taken by participants as learning experiences. Here's a quote by somebody who assaulted the Capitol, so excuse the language, it's not mine. "That's what we fucking need to have, 30,000 guns up here." This was what an assaulter said when he was frustrated the group wasn't entering the Capitol fast enough to do the job of wrecking it. Someone next to him answered, "That'll be for the next trip." That's a very striking quote. So what does this mean for the future? January 6th was a wake-up call for many for the new reality of the GOP. It showed, like no other event, the party's scorn for American democracy, its norms, its customs, including the idea that the loser of an election should give the winner the respect of vacating office. So democracy has been an honor system, and somebody like Trump comes along and makes and legitimizes the idea that you can be lawless. You can throw all of these things out the window. And now he's out of the White House. Trump will be free to act as an outside agitator and work freely with extremists in and outside the Republican Party to further destabilize American democracy. And the goal going forward could be to create chaos, including with acts of violence. So the Biden administration would seem incapable of, quote, keeping order, increasing the appetite for a recapture of the White House and a, quote, law and order governance for 2024. And this is an old playbook, one partly used in Chile before the 1973 coup to cultivate an appetite for military rule. And this endgame matters because January 6th was an inside job. Trump's advisors, his campaign, and donors were among the organizers and participants. And more is coming out about how inside job it was, and also how early the planning started in December for what we know now. So the danger to our republic is not external to the establishment, but comes from within it. And so one thing, that's started, but we need far more of that and fast, is investigations at the local level and federal commissions to assess exactly what the scope is of infiltration of military, law enforcement, and government by extremists. So to conclude, if there's a silver lining, it's that Trump has left us a roadmap of the potholes and weaknesses in our democracy and institutions. And that we need to reverse the culture of secrecy and corruption and all the things that allowed him to do what he did. And this week, as it turns out, is Sunshine Week. There are new, for transparency, there are new initiatives and certainly a new appreciation of the importance of accountability and openness in government. And I also want to conclude on a positive note that historically speaking, we accomplished something that very few countries have. We voted out a wannabe tyrant. We interrupted an ongoing process of authoritarian capture. And that's something to celebrate and draw sustenance from as we do the hard work of protecting our democracy in the next years. Thanks.
Thank you, Ruth, for this wonderful presentation. In my opening remarks, I said that American exceptionalism is perhaps an empty rhetoric, but maybe based on your comment that we were able to vote a wannabe tyrant out, maybe there's some exceptionalism that gives us a glimmer of hope. And as the host of the talk, maybe I would like to ask the first question. With the voting out of Trump, there's quite a bit of optimism in Europe that, you know, like a possible authoritarian was successfully removed from the office by electoral process. And as historians, we always tend to look back at history, but since you mentioned that you successfully predicted in your CNN op-ed what is to come in 2017, maybe I would like to ask you for another prediction. Do you think, did we turn the tide of authoritarianism in the global scale, or do you think this tide will go on for a little while?
I don't think we've turned the tide. It's interesting that a lot of these strongmen, they're not young. They're older men. They're aging. That whole generation, and it's not clear. And these kinds of rulers don't like successors. They can't psychologically abide successors. So remember what Putin did, like when he finished his 2 terms as president in 2008, and then he did this tandem government, so he flipped to prime minister and put like a protege in. They can do tricks like that. So at some point now, some of them have, you know, been able to arrange things to stay in office as long as they want to, like Orban and Putin. But there will be a natural time out for this generation. So that's one thing, but that's not tomorrow.
Sure.
The other thing I'd say is that there will be this, I think they will, I wrote about all women, but the far right, there are a lot of strong female politicians, and I think we'll have an authoritarian state led by one, which doesn't solve any of the problems. They won't strip their shirt off like Putin and Mussolini used to do, but all the other things, the racism and the repression, that would remain the same. So I think that it's very important what happened in the US. And I do think that if we manage to build on this and keep the Republicans out in 2024, that will send a real message that could revert, that could, you know, help things abroad.
Thank you. And I will start reading our questions from the audience. And please write down any questions that you might have in the Q&A function, and I will read it out. We have a question from Latrice Davis. I'm interested in hearing Ruth's thoughts on what occurred in Portland last summer and how it ties into this subject. Thank you.
Yeah, that was very, very frightening, very, very awful show of the fury of the state. Also, you know, one of the things that the Trump administration accomplished was it added two old enemies of white Christians, such as people of color, all kinds of people of color, Muslims. Trump may love Israel, but anti-Semitism was way up. So to those historic enemies of the right, Trump added new ones. He started to criminalize protesters. And we are very, very lucky that he and William Barr are out right now, because at the state level, there were already lots of laws trying to criminalize protest and make it, for example, in West Virginia, you could run somebody over with a car and you wouldn't be liable if you're a police officer, stuff like that. So, so they added new enemies, which is civil dissenters and also journalists. And so in Portland, it was also one of the scenes where journalists were assaulted and detained. And this was new. This autocrats have to turn the public opinion against journalists because they're corrupt. And it's like an insurance policy. So when things come out about them, and Trump eventually admitted he was doing this, they all do this. They criminalize journalists in a way. So Portland became a kind of petri dish for all of this. And because the mayor came out early on, against Trump, this was one of the interesting things, was that Trump was penalizing, as like in an autocratic way, governors who dared to defy him. And so Portland became a laboratory of this state, kind of federal state relationship of, and of course the resistance and protests were very, very active there. So it's not surprising that Portland became a place where there was federal, agents and unmarked, and it was one of the main places where people were stuffed into unmarked cars. And so it was a laboratory of something that was, if they'd stayed in power, a model of policing and repression that was going to be taken national. This is very clear. And I was tracking the signs. I remember in 2019 and again in 2020, the Department of Defense tweeted a call to citizens to identify any unused urban tunnels that were around. And I immediately thought, uh-oh, counterinsurgency. They're going to take the war home, right? This was going on. This was before the Black Lives Matter protests. So that's how I see Portland. It was a test case for what was going to be done nationally.
Yep. Thank you. And we have another question from Albert Goldson. Will the January 6th insurrection will serve as an inspiration for nationalists in Germany in the upcoming elections and France, as well as in 2024 in America?
Yeah, I mean, as a work of propaganda, I studied propaganda. The site of, I don't remember his name, that guy sitting with his feet on Nancy Pelosi's desk, the sight of these people able to overwhelm the Capitol Police and trash the building, the sight of lawmakers forced to scurry and hide, run for their lives. This is extremely powerful stuff, especially because it's the United States and the Capitol, right? And of course, we had the warning signs in Michigan. Like, if you put like this attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan in a foreign context, because my strength as an analyst has always been that my parents are not American, and I did study American history in high school, but I take a global lens, studying foreign autocracies, and turn it on America. And when you do that, and you look at stuff like the governor of Michigan was kidnapped, was almost kidnapped, and this state house was assaulted. This is like, you know, the years of what happened in Germany and Italy in the 1970s, and it's extremism. This is extremism, and yet we brushed it. We didn't want to deal with it. So then the Capitol, of course, it's going to be inspiring extremists around the world, because they think if this can fall so easily, and indeed without many consequences, because the GOP has essentially condoned it, and Trump's popularity is still sky high. So they've gotten away with it, and getting away with it is the essence of extremism and authoritarianism. So it's very damaging from the optics, for propaganda, for tactics. It's highly damaging in ways we haven't fully digested yet.
And I have one more question. You mentioned the failed coup attempt as a, like possibly a learning curve and almost like a dry run. And I've been reading quite a bit in the recent political commentaries, and some analysts are warning that America's next autocrat will be much more savvy and smart. It might be harder to root him or her out. Do you agree with this, or do you have any thoughts about it? That if we were to face another figure other than Mr. Trump, who I think himself is a very smart person, otherwise he would not have become the president of the United States. And I think he used that seemingly not so smart persona to his advantage until he came to power. Do you think that if we were to sort of like have an autocrat who is smart by like common standards, he or she will be more savvy and harder to get out of the power?
In some ways, yes, but Trump was very unusual for a few reasons. The whole Russian thing, many GOP people are compromised with Russia, but not to his extent. He truly, I've repeated this so many times on Twitter because it's really like a paradigm shift. Trump had no desire to govern in any traditional sense of the word. His main goal was to use the presidency to make money for Trump Organization and to build a personality cult to keep people loyal to him, which he did with astonishing success, to domesticate the party and to spread hatred because of polarization allows him to stay in power. But he had zero interest in governance, and the main goal remained making money. In fact, I thought this was it's funny, not funny, that he sent a cease and desist letter to the Republican Party and its fundraising thing, saying they can't use he wants people to give money to Trump, to his own, political action committee, which we've learned through investigative journalists, classic corrupt autocrat fashion. It ends up in Trump Organization, or somehow with his private, things. So he was very unusual for that reason, and there isn't anybody else on the horizon who has a business of that magnitude and is in debt to the Chinese, to Deutsche Bank. There's nobody else with that scope of debts and who is a businessman. So there's that. The other thing is there's nobody else right now who would enjoy the personality cult that he has. He was able to build this cult to an astonishing degree because he had decades of experience as a marketer, as a seducer, as a reality TV host. He knew how, and he has in common with other of these guys like Modi. They know how to use the codes of celebrity and social media and digital storytelling and make themselves whatever the country needs them to be. They will ally with anyone. They will be anything you need them to be. It's like, think of Modi, who Instagrams his life. Modi has an app. Modi uses holograms to be everywhere. I mean, he's very advanced. I was always worried Trump would get an app. when I read that about Modi. So he's unusual, but to the question of could somebody come in and be more disciplined? Yes, because Trump spent 1 out of every 3 days at a Trump property and not governing, so that he was, in that sense, he was not lazy. His goals were simply different goals. They were to make money for himself. But it's true that if somebody came in and didn't watch TV 8 hours a day or go golfing, they could do a lot more. But on the other hand, we have underestimated how much Trump has done. He's done a huge amount. And we don't even know the full scope of what he's done to bureaucracy in particular. He's accomplished a ton. He, meaning his Stephen Miller and all these collaborators, they did a huge amount of damage.
Not to mention the change of the composition of the Supreme Court is just...
And he appointed 300 judges. So this is why this argument that Trump was a clown and somebody else could come in, I only accept it partially. Because what if somebody else came in, they would have 350 judges. 300 judges is a lot.
Sure.
So Trump is not incompetent. This narrative is totally unhelpful.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Ruth, for this wonderful presentation. And I don't think we have any more questions. We have a comment about a book recommendation. Latris Davis recommends Democracy in Chains for understanding today's events.
Yes, that's a great book.
It's a great book, and
really important book.
I will definitely read that after I finish this great book. So thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate your perspectives. And thank you to our audience for joining us this evening. This will be available recorded at Urban Democracy Lab and via NYU stream. So please tell your friends if they would like to watch it. It will be made available online. On that note, I wish everyone a good night. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank you.